Hello Year 9 and welcome to the last class for this chapter, Chapter 1. We're dealing with compound interest and depreciation today. So before we take any notes, I just want you to watch along and we're going to do some comparisons. So what I want you to imagine is that we're going to earn some interest. Let's say we go to the bank. If we put $100 into the bank, the bank's going to tell you to leave the money in the bank and they'll add to it. They'll give you what's called interest. So let's say they give you 10% each year. So how much would you have in the bank after 1 year? Instead of having $100, you'd have $100 plus 10% of $100. You'd end up with $110 in this case, and that's called interest. Now there are two types of interest that you can calculate. There's a simple interest and a compound interest. And it's important that we understand the difference between these two types of interest. Now, let's take an example where Homer puts some money into a bank. So Homer's got 10% simple interest on his $200. That means each year he's going to get 10% of his $200. Now 10% of $200 is $20. So every year he'll get $20 worth of interest. So he starts with $200. After 1 year he's got 200 plus the 20, he's got $220. After another year, he's got $240. Then he's got $260. Then he's got $280. And after 5 years, he ends up with $300. That's if he was actually using simple interest. Simple interest means that it's nice and easy. He just gets the same amount of an increase every year. Let's talk about compound interest, however. Though Professor Frink has 10% compound interest on his $200. That means every year, however much is in his account, is going to increase by 10%. So let's have a look. He starts with $200. After 1 year, he increases that by 10%, which is the same as multiplying 200 by 110%, and you'll get $220. So that's the same as Homer. But for the next year, he earns another 10% of $220. Now 10% of $220 is $22. You add that on, you get $242. Another way to do it would be just to go 220 times 110% to give you the $242. For the next year, times it by 110%, he's got a messy amount. Times it again, he gets another messy amount. Times it again, he gets another messy amount. So Professor Frink ends up after 5 years with $322.10. Well, let's do some comparing. After the first year, Homer and Frink had the same amount, but after the second year it was a little bit different. The third year a bit different again. And every year Professor Frink is getting more and more money. He ends up with $22.10 extra because he actually earns interest on money that he I'll say that again, he earns interest on interest that he earned earlier. Compound interest will generate more money for you. Now, on a calculator, Bart puts $300 into an account, simple interest of 12% for 8 years. Now we've used PRN, it's the same as PRT. It's 300 times 12% times 8. He earns $288 in interest. So that means he starts with $300 plus his $288 interest. He has $588 in his bank after 8 years. However, Martin, if he did exactly the same amount of money, exactly the same percentage, exactly the same time, but he worked with compound interest, it's a much more complicated formula. We'll talk about it later. He'll end up with $742.79. Let's compare them. Bart ends up with $588. Martin ends up with $742.79 when they started with the same amount of money and they put it in the bank for the same time using the same interest rate. Bart used simple interest, Martin used compound interest. You can see compound interest is going to earn you a lot more money. So let's get into this exercise now. So if you can get your booklets ready, and we'll start by talking about some terms first. when you're talking about using compound interest, we're going to use the letter capital A, and that stands for the full amount of money that you end up with. We're going to use capital P. That talks about the principal. That's the amount of money you started with. We're going to use a little letter R, which talks about the interest rate as a percentage. We're going to talk about a little letter N, which is the number of payments you make, but it's normally in years. We're going to do some questions where it's not. And there is the formula that we use. So you can use this formula by writing it on a formula sheet. It's just a matter of knowing when to use it. You use it when it's compound interest, not simple interest. And if you want to find out how much interest you earned, you've got to take the final amount that you end up with minus what you started with, and it'll tell you how much interest you earn using compound interest. Now, it's important that we understand that the interest rate and the time period, these two here, have to both be in years, or both be in months, or both be in days. They have to be in the same unit of measurement. So here's our compound interest formula. And just so you can see it, if you are losing money, the depreciation formula is exactly the same, except the plus sign becomes a minus sign. Alright, let's look at some examples and see how we go. Shirley is to invest $19,000 for 2 years at 7% per annum with interest compounded. That tells us to use the compound interest formula. And it's compounded annually or yearly. So, let's write down our formula because we now know it's compound. There's the formula written down. What's P? P is the principal. What was the principal? 19,000 is what I started with. What's R? That's the interest rate, 7% per annum. Or you could write 0.07 if you wanted to write it as a decimal. What's N? 2 years. What's A? That's what we're trying to find, the amount that we end up with, the value of the investment, how much you end up with when it's matured, how much you end up with at the end of it. So that's what we're looking for. So I can put P, R, and N in my formula. I can plug that into my calculator, and that'll generate how much money I end up with at the end of 2 years. If I was asked how much interest I earned, and it was a compound interest question, I need to say how much money did I end up with minus what I started with. I subtract them, and it tells me how much interest I earned for the compound interest question. Let's proceed to example number 2. Find the amount of interest paid on $30,000 for 4 years at 8%. And this is a trick for this question because it says the interest is compounded monthly. Now, if the interest is compounded monthly, that means the interest rate must be monthly as well, and it's not for this question, so we're going to have to make some adjustments before we can answer anything. So let's write down what we do know. We know the principal is $30,000, so there's my principal. I know the interest rate is 8% per year, but I'm going to write it as 8% over 12 because I want to figure out what the interest rate is per month, and to change years to months you divide by 12. There are 48 months in 4 years because each year has 12 months. 4 12s are 48. I want to find out the full amount I end up with, which will then allow me to find out how much interest I was earning on this particular question. So let's put in our formula. What we do know is this: the principal's 30,000. 1 plus R. R is 8% over 12. N is 48 because everything has been converted into months because it was compounded monthly. Put it into your calculator, and it tells us that after 4 years or 48 months, our full amount in the bank is $41,269.98. We started with 30,000. We've now got over 41,000. That's not bad. But the question said, find the amount of interest that was paid. So how much interest did we actually earn? Well, the interest paid is the full amount at the end minus what we started with, which means for this particular loan, by having, or the investment, by having the money locked away for 4 years, we made $11,000, over $11,000 in interest by letting it sit and accumulate interest monthly for 4 years. Let's go to our next example. Fozzie bought a truck for 6 years. Fozzie bought a truck 6 years ago for $35,000, and he assumed the value of the truck is going to get less, it's going to depreciate at the rate of 23% every year. So how much is a truck worth after 6 years? Well, we're depreciating, and for our depreciation questions, we're going to use our formula with a minus sign in it. So what's P? Well, that's what we started with. We started with a value of $35,000 for our truck. What's R? The interest rate is 23% per year. What's N? 6 years. For this question, you'll notice that the interest rate and the time, both in years, that's good. What's A? That's what we want to know, the amount that the truck is worth at the end of 6 years. So we put those values into our formula. The truck after 6 years is no longer worth $35,000. Through wear and tear and age, it's now worth $7,294.78. So it's not worth much at all compared to its original price. So it's now time to try questions. Some of them will be tricky. Do the best you can and ask for help if you need it. Goodbye for now.